shrieking shack fell silent in the wake of the trio's footsteps. What remained was the slow, wet rasp of Severus Snape's breathing as he waited to be reunited with the love of his life on the other side, beyond the land of the living. So this was death. Nagini's venom burned like living fire in his veins, a corrosive, intimate agony that gnawed through muscle and thought alike. Each breath was a betrayal and proof he still lived when he should not. His vision swam, the world blurred at the edges, shadows stretched and folded in on themselves. Potter has it, he thought dimly. The memories. Lily. If this were the end, then at least the truth had been given its chance to live. Minutes passed, or seconds. Time had fractured, meaningless under the weight of venom and blood loss. Severus waited for the dark to close fully around him. Instead, only pain remained. His fingers clawed at the floor, nails scraping against wood. His left arm refused to obey him, numb and heavy, but the right arm dragged his body forward inch by inch. Every movement sent a fresh wave of fire through his neck, down his spine, into his limbs. "You cannot have me yet," he whispered hoarsely, though to whom he did not know. The shack's door loomed ahead. When he finally reached the door, it took what little strength remained to force it open. Night air rushed in. He collapsed halfway through the doorway, gasping on the floor. Hogsmeade lay quiet beyond the trees, deceptively peaceful for a village perched on the edge of war. Hogwarts burned in the distance, green and red light tearing the sky apart. Severus dragged himself forward, refusing to die. Somewhere along the way, his consciousness frayed. A voice cut through the haze. "Merlin's beard, Severus?" Strong hands seized his shoulders. He hissed and tried feebly to reach for his wand. "No, no, don't do that," the voice said. Good heavens, you're alive." Horace Slughorn loomed above him, shocked beyond belief to see the former headmaster again. "Severus, how in all that's holy are you still breathing?" "Stubbornness," Severus said faintly. Slughorn did not laugh. Instead, he muttered a rapid string of incantations. His hands were already glowing with healing magic as he worked to slow the venom's spread. "We need shelter," Slughorn said, "and fire whiskey, and quiet. The 3 broomsticks, it's warded." With a surprising strength born of adrenaline and desperation, Slughorn hauled Severus to his feet, half carrying, half dragging him through the village streets. The world narrowed to the rhythmic crunch of boots on gravel and the pounding of Severus's heart, each beat slower than the last. The 3 broomsticks' door burst open. The pub was empty, abandoned in haste, as its guests had either fled or joined the Battle of Hogwarts. Slughorn lowered Severus onto a bench near the hearth. "There," Slughorn said. "Stay awake. That's an order." He conjured a thick bandage and pressed it gently, but firmly, against Severus's neck. Outside, the war raged on. Inside the 3 broomsticks, Severus clung to life by sheer force of will, unaware that the world he had sacrificed everything to protect was about to change, and that his survival would ensure the war was far from over. The first thing Harry felt upon returning to the land of the living was pain. Breath slammed back into his lungs as if forced there, burning and sharp. His heart stuttered, then lurched into motion, each beat a thunderclap inside his chest. Darkness pressed in from all sides. "I'm back." The thought barely had time to form before memory followed it, crashing down in fragments. Green light, Voldemort's face twisted with triumph. The strange, serene place where time did not exist, King's Cross, Dumbledore, and the choice. "You can go on." Harry lay utterly still, fear locking every muscle in place. The forbidden forest loomed around him, ancient and watchful, its shadows alive with whispers. He could hear voices now. "My lord," came Lucius Malfoy's trembling murmur. Is it done?" Harry felt it then, Voldemort's cold presence looming over him. He did not dare open his eyes. He let his body go slack, trying not to move a muscle. Silence stretched. Then Voldemort laughed. It was a high, thin sound, echoing through the trees, scraping raw against Harry's nerves. "Harry Potter," Voldemort said softly, almost fondly. "The boy who lived." Boots crunched nearer. Harry could feel the vibration of them through the ground. "The boy who died," Voldemort corrected. A cry tore through the clearing. "No," Hagrid choked. Harry's chest tightened painfully at the sound of Hagrid's grief. Harry imagined him there, bound and helpless. Bellatrix Lestrange giggled in delight. "I told you, my lord. He was never special. Just lucky." Voldemort raised his wand. Nagini. Something slithered. Even without opening his eyes, Harry knew she was there. A flicker of dread surged through him. "Ensure it," Voldemort said calmly. "I won't be deceived by another trick." Before agony exploded through his body, Harry screamed. It tore out of him, raw and involuntary, a sound of pure pain and shock that shattered the forest's stillness. The clearing erupted. "What?" Lucius gasped. "He's alive," someone shouted. Bellatrix shrieked with laughter, clapping her hands wildly. "Oh, my lord! Did you see that? Did you hear that?" Hagrid roared. It was not a word, but a sound of fury and grief and defiance so powerful it shook the trees themselves. "Harry!" The world snapped into brutal clarity. Voldemort's face twisted in shock. Death Eaters staggered back and raised their wands in confusion. Nagini recoiled too, hissing. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Voldemort's expression hardened, and shock turned into cold and murderous certainty. "No," he hissed. "Impossible." Harry sagged forward, vision blurring again, his scream fading into a ragged gasp. Strength bled out of him, and darkness was closing in fast. Bellatrix was still laughing. Hagrid was still roaring. As Harry's consciousness slipped once more into blackness, the last thing he heard was Voldemort's voice. "Kill him." The boy who lived had finally died. The first thing Harry felt upon returning to the land of the living was pain. Breath slammed back into his lungs as if forced there, burning and sharp. His heart stuttered, then lurched into motion, each beat a thunderclap inside his chest. Darkness pressed in from all sides. "I'm back." The thought barely had time to form before memory followed it, crashing down in fragments. Green light. Voldemort's face twisted with triumph. The strange, serene place where time did not exist. King's Cross, Dumbledore, and the choice. "You can go on." Harry lay utterly still, fear locking every muscle in place. The forbidden forest loomed around him, ancient and watchful, its shadows alive with whispers. He could hear voices now. "My lord," came Lucius Malfoy's trembling murmur. Is it done?" Harry felt it then, Voldemort's cold presence looming over him. He did not dare open his eyes. He let his body go slack, trying not to move a muscle. Silence stretched. Then Voldemort laughed. It was a high, thin sound, echoing through the trees, scraping raw against Harry's nerves. "Harry Potter," Voldemort said softly, almost fondly. "The boy who lived." Boots crunched nearer. Harry could feel the vibration of them through the ground. "The boy who died," Voldemort corrected. A cry tore through the clearing. "No," Hagrid choked. Harry's chest tightened painfully at the sound of Hagrid's grief. Harry imagined him there, bound and helpless. Bellatrix Lestrange giggled in delight. "I told you, my lord. He was never special. Just lucky." Voldemort raised his wand. Nagini. Something slithered. Even without opening his eyes, Harry knew she was there. A flicker of dread surged through him. "Ensure it," Voldemort said calmly. "I won't be deceived by another trick." Before Harry could brace himself, before thought could catch up to terror, Nagini struck. Agony exploded through his body. Harry screamed. It tore out of him, raw and involuntary, a sound of pure pain and shock that shattered the forest's stillness. The clearing erupted. "What?" Lucius gasped. "He's alive," someone shouted. Bellatrix shrieked with laughter, clapping her hands wildly. "Oh, my lord! Did you see that? Did you hear that?" Hagrid roared. It was not a word, but a sound of fury and grief and defiance so powerful it shook the trees themselves. "Harry!" The world snapped into brutal clarity. Voldemort's face twisted in shock. Death Eaters staggered back and raised their wands in confusion. Nagini recoiled too, hissing. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Voldemort's expression hardened, and shock turned into cold and murderous certainty. "No," he hissed. "Impossible." Harry sagged forward, vision blurring again, his scream fading into a ragged gasp. Strength bled out of him, and darkness was closing in fast. Bellatrix was still laughing. Hagrid was still roaring. As Harry's consciousness slipped once more into blackness, the last thing he heard was Voldemort's voice. "Kill him." The boy who lived had finally died. The Battle of Hogwarts was coming to an end, but the castle's defenders refused to give up. Cho Chang wiped blood from her lip and raised her wand again. Michael Corner was beside her, determined to defend his girlfriend. Padma and Parvati flanked them, shielding each other. Bill and Fleur fought as one. Percy Weasley stood with his brother George and Angelina Johnson. Hannah Abbott whispered a shaking prayer under her breath before firing another stunning spell into the smoke. They had seen too much to stop now. "We hold," Percy shouted hoarsely, "for everyone who fell." Green light cut him off. "Michael!" Cho screamed. The curse struck Michael Corner square in the chest. He collapsed at her feet, eyes staring, wand slipping from nerveless fingers. Cho dropped. Dolohov laughed. His wand flicked lazily. The purple spell slammed into Bill Weasley like a physical blow. Bill cried out as agony tore through him, every nerve set alight. His head hit a shattered stone as he fell to the ground. "Bill!" Fleur screamed, dropping to her knees beside him. "Stay with me. Please, stay with me." Death Eaters closed in. George roared in fury, firing curses blindly. Angelina dragged Percy back as the Death Eaters fired curses at them. Padma and Parvati fought back-to-back again, defiant even as their numbers thinned. Cho staggered to her feet, grief sharpening into something dangerous. However, before she could raise her wand, she was interrupted by manic laughter. Incarcerus. Ropes snapped out of thin air, wrapping around her arms, her legs, her chest. Cho cried out as she was slammed to the ground. She struggled, gasped, and cried while trying to break free from her bonds. "Let her watch," Bellatrix purred, stepping into view. "I enjoy that part." Cho's vision blurred as she watched it happen. Hannah was stunned, collapsing like a puppet with cut strings. Angelina went down next, dragged backward by unseen hands. Percy fell to his knees under a barrage of curses, screaming George's name as he was disarmed and bound. George fought like a madman. It took 5 Death Eaters to bring him down. Cho lay helpless on the floor, forced to watch as friends were stunned, bound, dragged away, faces slack with unconsciousness or twisted in pain. Fleur sobbed openly now, clinging to Bill as Death Eaters ripped her wand from her hand. Cho lay there, shaking and crying, staring at Michael's still body only a few feet away, unable to reach him. The world felt hollowed out, scooped clean of meaning. Draco Malfoy lingered near the shattered steps of the Great Hall. Around him, Death Eaters moved with grim efficiency, binding prisoners and dragging bodies into cages. This was supposed to be the victory, yet he felt nothing. Draco's eyes caught on Cho Chang, bound on the ground, her face streaked with ash and tears. A little farther away lay Michael Corner, unnaturally still. Draco looked away in shame. Lucius no longer stood tall. He looked older than Draco had ever seen him, smaller, diminished, like a man who had wagered everything and discovered the prize was hollow. Narcissa stood on Draco's other side, pale as marble. Her eyes followed Voldemort as he moved through the courtyard, unhurried, supreme, and indifferent. He did not look at them. He never did. "They're celebrating," Draco said, watching Bellatrix laugh as prisoners were hauled past her. "They think this means something." Narcissa's voice was very soft. "It means nothing to him." Lucius nodded faintly. "We were never allies. Only tools." Draco remembered the dark mark burning, remembered being praised and threatened in the same breath, remembered standing on a tower with his hands shaking while a man begged for his life. He had thought victory would feel like relief. Instead, it felt like standing on the wrong side of a grave. Voldemort passed near them then, his presence sucking the air from the space around him. Death Eaters straightened instinctively. We don't matter, Draco said, almost to himself. Narcissa placed a trembling hand on his arm. You matter, she said fiercely. To me. Lucius closed his eyes for a brief moment. When this ends, he said quietly, history will not remember us as victors. Draco looked back out at the ruined courtyard, at Hogwarts burning under a rising sun that illuminated nothing but loss. No, Draco said. It'll remember us as cowards. The ghost drifted through ruined corridors and shattered halls, pale and shaken. Nearly headless Nick hovered near the remains of the entrance hall, his translucent face stricken with grief. Moaning Myrtle wept openly. Helena Ravenclaw's ghost stood above the courtyard, hands clasped, staring down at the devastation of the castle her mother had helped build. She saw Cho Chang being bound and dragged by Bellatrix into the Great Hall. Helena locked eyes with Cho and desperately wanted to help, even though she knew she was powerless to do anything. Even Peeves remained silent, drifting across the corridors watching as the children he had pranked for years dragged in chains, crying. Bodies lay everywhere. Teachers, students, Death Eaters, centaurs, their powerful forms stilled among broken arrows and shattered wands. Blood darkened the stones. Hogwarts looked mortal at last. In the headmaster's office, portraits whispered frantically, turning toward one another in disbelief. Even Phineas Nigellus Black's portrait didn't know what to say. Albus Dumbledore's portrait stood rigid, refusing to give up hope. This is not the end, he said quietly, though no living ear heard him. Chains rattled as the surviving captives were herded into the Great Hall. Their wrists were bound with cold iron and spellwork that bit into skin. They were forced to their knees beneath the enchanted ceiling, now dark and smoke-stained. The banners had changed. Gone were Gryffindor red, Ravenclaw blue, and Hufflepuff gold. In their place hung only Slytherin green and silver. The Death Eaters lined up before the dais. They no longer wore masks as there was no reason to stay hidden. The Malfoys stood among them. Draco's eyes were fixed on the floor in shame. Narcissa looked at Bellatrix with disgust. Lucius stared ahead, expression carefully blank, as though daring himself not to look at the chains. Voldemort ascended the steps to the high table. He spread his arms. My victory is complete, he declared. Harry Potter is dead. The so-called Chosen One has failed. Bellatrix laughed as she held Cho by the neck. Cho struggled in vain to break free, but Bellatrix's grip was cold as iron. The Ministry has fallen, Voldemort continued. Magical Britain is mine. It belongs, rightfully, to purebloods, to those strong enough to seize power. He turned slowly, red eyes sweeping the captives. Hogwarts will no longer divide its students into houses that foster weakness and disunity. There will be no Gryffindors, no Ravenclaws, no Hufflepuffs. Only Slytherin green gleamed above them. There will be obedience, Voldemort said softly, or extinction. A voice cut through the hall. Always so dramatic, Tom. Every head snapped upward. Dumbledore's portrait had stepped forward within its frame, eyes alight with fury and sorrow intertwined. The whispers of other portraits fell silent. You may burn this castle to the ground, Dumbledore said calmly, but you will never own what it stands for. You have won a battle, Tom Riddle, not the war. You will lose in the end. You always do. A hush fell. For a heartbeat, Voldemort stared at the portrait of his fallen enemy. Then his face twisted with rage. Enough. He raised his wand, and fire erupted. Portrait after portrait burst into flames, centuries of witches and wizards screaming silently as canvas curled and burned. Frames blackened, paint blistered, and history was reduced to ash. Dumbledore's portrait burned last. His gaze never left Voldemort's as the fire consumed him. The great hall filled with smoke and the crackle of destruction. The captives coughed, shielding their faces, tears streaming not just from smoke, but from the finality of it all. Draco turned away. Narcissa closed her eyes. Voldemort lowered his wand at last, surveying the ruin he had claimed. Hogwarts is mine, he said. But beneath the ashes, beneath the chains and banners and fire, something endured, unseen and unbroken. Far from the castle's shadow, the war that Voldemort believed finished was already learning how to survive. Laughter, sharp, manic, relieved, spilled from the great hall as Death Eaters drank stolen fire whiskey and congratulated one another with blood-stained hands. Victory songs rose and fell, brittle with exhaustion. Voldemort left them to it. He stepped out into the courtyard alone. The air was cold, heavy with smoke and the copper-sweet stench of death. Bodies lay everywhere, strewn without pattern or hierarchy. Students and teachers, centaurs and giants, masked followers and nameless conscripts. Enemies and allies alike had been reduced to the same stillness. Voldemort stood among them and felt the emptiness settle inside him. Harry Potter was dead. Dumbledore was gone. The prophecy had been fulfilled, if one chose to believe in such things. The two figures who had defined his opposition for decades were nothing now but memory and ash. The castle that had once been Tom Riddle's only refuge, his first true home, stood conquered behind him, its towers blackened, its magic bent to his will. This was what he had wanted, but emptiness surprised him. It was not grief. He was long past such weaknesses. It was something colder, wider, a vast, echoing absence where purpose had once lived. For so long, his existence had been shaped by pursuit. Power wrested from fear, immortality stolen from death itself, enemies crushed one by one. Now there were none left worthy of the name. He looked down at a fallen Death Eater. He did not recognize the man. How many had died tonight for him? Hundreds. Snatchers, loyalists, wizards bound by fear and Imperius alike. Nagini stirred nearby. Voldemort's red eyes flicked toward her. One, he thought. One Horcrux left. His soul, what remained of it, was stretched thin, fractured beyond any natural repair. He could feel the damage constantly now, a faint, persistent ache beneath his thoughts, like a fault line threatening to split wider at the slightest misstep. Immortality, he knew at last, was no longer a thing he could take for granted. Voldemort lifted his gaze to the castle looming above the courtyard. Hogwarts stood silent, conquered but not welcoming. Stone remembered. Magic remembered. He could feel it watching him, enduring him, waiting. For the first time in many years, Voldemort felt something uncomfortably close to fatigue. He turned away from the dead and walked back toward the Great Hall, where his followers waited to celebrate a victory that already felt fragile in his hands. Voldemort had nearly reached the doors of the Great Hall when footsteps hurried after him. "My lord." Bellatrix swept to his side, eyes shining, her movements electric with triumph. Dolohov followed more slowly, his expression sharp with expectation rather than joy. "The castle is ours," Bellatrix said breathlessly. "The ministry is ashes. Britain kneels. Tell us, what comes next?" Dolohov inclined his head. "The world," he said simply. "The Muggle world." Voldemort stopped. The torches along the corridor guttered as his magic shifted, responding instinctively to his mood. Bellatrix mistook the pause for anticipation and pressed on eagerly. "Grindelwald was right," she said fervently. "We should not hide. No more secrecy, no more shadows. The crown, the parliament, let them kneel. Wizards ruling openly, as we were meant to." Dolohov nodded. "In Russia, my family fought for that vision," he said. "For Grindelwald's new order. A world remade. Now is the right time to fulfill his legacy." Voldemort turned slowly to face them. "I killed Grindelwald," he said coldly. The words fell like a blade. Bellatrix stopped smiling. The news came as a surprise to her. Dolohov stared at his master, genuinely stunned. At Nurmengard, Voldemort continued, uninterested in their reactions. A month ago, he was diminished. His death was unremarkable. Dolohov's breath left him in a harsh exhale. "You." He stopped, struggling to find the right words. He was the greatest revolutionary our world ever produced. "He was an obstacle," Voldemort replied. "One I required removed to claim the Elder Wand." Bellatrix laughed too loudly. "Of course you did, my lord. Of course. Grindelwald was nothing compared to you." Dolohov did not laugh. "You killed him," he said slowly, disbelief giving way to something darker. Voldemort's red eyes narrowed. "The Muggle world is not ours to take, yet," he said. "Not through open war. I have seen what Muggles are capable of when pressed." Images flickered unbidden in his mind. London skies burning red, sirens screaming, buildings collapsing into flame and dust. The Blitz. A boy clutching stolen food in a bombed-out orphanage, watching fire fall from the heavens. They do not wield magic, Voldemort said, but they wield destruction on a scale you cannot comprehend. Dolohov was boiling with frustration. Then what was all this for? He demanded, gesturing sharply toward the Great Hall, toward Hogwarts itself. I left my country 40 years ago, fought Aurors, rebels, children only to conquer a school. His voice dropped, bitter. This is not a new world. It is a cage. Something dangerous flickered between them. You mistake caution for fear, Voldemort said softly. Dolohov met his gaze without flinching. No, he said. I mistake it for cowardice. The corridor seemed to hold its breath. Bellatrix stepped between them instantly. No, you don't understand, she said desperately, to Dolohov or perhaps to herself. There's always more. There's always another step. My lord has a plan. He always does. Voldemort did not look at her. We will establish order in magical Britain, he said. We will consolidate power, rebuild our numbers, root out dissent. Anything beyond that is unnecessary. Dolohov let out a harsh and joyless laugh. You're not Grindelwald, he said, and you're not a god. You're a man afraid of the next war. Voldemort's wand moved. Dolohov vanished in a burst of smoke, banished rather than killed, spared not out of mercy, but calculation. Bellatrix stood trembling, eyes shining with unshed tears and fanatic hope. He didn't mean it, she whispered. He's wrong. You're everything. You've always been everything. Voldemort finally looked at her. Serve, he said, or be forgotten. Bellatrix sank to her knees at once. Always, my lord. Always. Severus woke to the smell of bitter herbs and old wood. For a moment, he thought he was dead. Ah, you're awake. Slughorn's voice came from nearby, tired and thick with something far heavier than relief. Severus opened his eyes slowly, blinking against the dim light of the 3 broomsticks. Empty bottles lined every surface. The air hummed faintly with layered enchantments. The venom, Severus croaked. Gone, Slughorn said quietly. Drained, neutralized, purged. You should not be alive, Severus. But then again, you never did care for expectations. Severus shifted, testing himself. Pain lingered, but it was distant now. What happened, he asked. Slughorn hesitated. That alone told Severus everything. We lost, Slughorn said at last. His voice broke on the word. The battle. Hogwarts. Potter is dead. Severus closed his eyes. Even knowing it was likely, perhaps inevitable, the words landed like a physical blow. Lily's son was dead. Hogwarts, his only true home, was gone. Minerva, Slughorn continued reluctantly. Flitwick, Hagrid, Kingsley, so many students. Severus, it was a massacre. Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. For a long moment, Severus said nothing. Grief was not new to him. It had carved its home in his bones decades ago. But this was a different cut. At least, Slughorn added softly, you lived. Severus let out a quiet, humorless breath. A questionable mercy. Slughorn sat heavily on the edge of a chair. He looked older than Severus had ever seen him. I'm leaving, he said. Tonight. France, perhaps. Or further. There's nothing left for us here. Severus opened his eyes again and looked at him fully. You're running. I'm surviving, Slughorn said sharply. Then his voice softened. Come with me. You've done more than your share. There's no shame in escape now. Severus pushed himself upright, ignoring Slughorn's startled protest. No, he exclaimed. Slughorn stared. Severus, Tom Riddle has won. Severus's hands curled slowly into fists. Tom Riddle, he repeated, the name tasting of old hatred. Took Lily, the love of my life, from this world. He stood tall and composed despite the bandages and exhaustion. His black eyes burned with something cold and inexhaustible. I do not know how to defeat him, Severus said, but I refuse to allow him eternity. Slughorn rose as well, anguish written plainly across his face. This is suicide. No, Severus replied quietly. This is penance. They stood there, two relics of a lost school and a lost war. At last, Slughorn nodded once. Then I suppose this is goodbye. For now, Severus said. He took his wand and walked down the creaking stairs of the Three Broomsticks. Dawn was breaking over Hogsmeade, pale and indifferent to the carnage that had happened last night. Outside, Severus paused. He did not look back. Magic gathered around him, responding to will alone. Slowly, deliberately, he rose from the ground, unsupported without the need for a broomstick. Slughorn watched from the doorway, speechless at the sight of his former student and colleague flying without aid. Severus turned south, away from Hogwarts' broken towers, away from ghosts and graves, toward the smoke-stained streets of Spinner's End, his childhood home, and where he had learned what love cost. The Ford Anglia hummed softly as it carried them south early in the morning. Ron sat rigid at the wheel, eyes fixed ahead but seeing nothing. Hermione stared out the passenger side window, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. In the back seat, Ginny pressed her forehead to the cold metal frame, shoulders shaking, while Luna sat beside her, one pale hand resting gently over Ginny's clenched fist. They crossed the Scottish-English border without noticing. Somewhere behind them lay Hogwarts, burned, conquered, and soaked in blood. Somewhere behind them lay Harry. Harry, who had always stood back up. Harry, who had never stayed dead before. The thought was unbearable. He can't be, Ginny whispered suddenly. He can't be gone. No one answered her. Ron's vision blurred, and he blinked hard, swiping angrily at his face with one hand before gripping the wheel again. Mom, he muttered. Dad. Fred. The name broke him. I didn't even get to say goodbye, he choked. And George, Percy, Bill, Merlin, Hermione, what if they're still alive? What if they're... We can't know, Hermione said quietly, but her voice shook too. Not now. Ginny sat up sharply. Then we should go back. Ron nodded immediately. She's right. We can't just leave them. They're our family. Luna watched them with sad, knowing eyes, but said nothing. Hermione turned toward them fully now, tears spilling freely. If we go back, we die, she said. Or worse, we get captured, and then there's nothing left. Ron slammed his hand against the steering wheel. So what? We just run. No, Hermione said fiercely. We survive. Silence fell again, thick and heavy. They didn't die in vain, Hermione went on, voice breaking as she forced the words out. Harry didn't. Your parents didn't. Fred didn't. Voldemort wants us to believe this is the end, that he's won forever. She shook her head. He hasn't. Ginny's eyes were red and hollow. Harry's dead, she whispered. How is that not the end? Hermione hesitated for a second. Because we're still here. She reached back, taking Ginny's hand, then Ron's arm, gripping both like anchors. Wars don't end in one night. Sometimes they go quiet. Sometimes they go underground. Ron stared at her. You're talking about leaving. Yes, Hermione said. Britain isn't safe. Not now. Not for years, maybe. We need allies. Resistance beyond Voldemort's reach. France. Germany. Anywhere. Ron laughed bitterly, running halfway across the world. Planning, Hermione corrected softly. Learning. Building something he can't crush overnight. She wiped her face with the back of her sleeve. It might take years. Decades, even. But when we come back, Voldemort, Bellatrix, the Malfoys, they will pay. Ginny looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in her expression, not acceptance, but resolve carved out of grief. For Harry, she said quietly. Ron nodded, tears sliding down his face unchecked. For Mum and Dad. For Fred. Luna spoke at last, her voice calm, steady, like a candle in the dark. For everyone who didn't get to run. The Anglia sped on, crossing deeper into England, carrying for broken hearts and one unbreakable promise. They were leaving Britain behind, but they were not surrendering. The war had only changed shape, and somewhere ahead, beyond borders and years, the reckoning waited. Antonin Dolohov walked alone on the streets of St. Petersburg. Red banners were torn down, buildings sagged with neglect. Men argued openly in the streets. voices sharp with hunger and drink, while police pretended not to see. This was not the Russia he had left. In the 1940s and 50s, power was absolute. The Muggles had feared their own government then, feared it enough that overthrowing it had felt inevitable. Antonin had believed, with a zeal bordering on reverence, that Grindelwald's vision would sweep east. Wizards would step out of the shadows and claim what history had denied them. A shattered statue lay on its side in a public square, face cracked clean through. Lenin, Antonin realized dimly. Nearby, Stalin's likeness had been reduced to rubble, chunks of stone scattered like bones. The Soviet Union was gone. Antonin stood very still while hiding his wand under his sleeve. All those years of planning, of waiting in exile, he had imagined returning to tear down an empire, but there was nothing left to tear down. This, he muttered, this is what you became. Chaos reigned where order, however brutal, had once stood. Crime slithered openly through the streets. Children begged. Men sold scraps of metal and dignity alike. The Muggle world had not been conquered by magic. It had rotted. Antonin turned away and slipped down a narrow alley, one that bent subtly at impossible angles. The noise dulled. The air shifted. A concealed sigil flared faintly as he crossed its threshold. The wizarding street revealed itself. Here, lanterns burned with steady blue flame. Shops were intact, warded, alive with quiet purpose. Wizards moved briskly, robes brushing against modern coats, faces tense but focused. Order, at least, survived somewhere. Antonin entered a small kiosk and snatched up a newspaper, flipping it open with rough hands. His eyes scanned headlines in Cyrillic runes. Fighting escalates in the Caucasus. Wizard casualties reported in Chechnya. He read more slowly. Islamist militias. Enchanted weapons. Wizards embedded alongside covert units, fighting battles the Muggle world could never be allowed to see. Spells clashing with rocket fire in mountain passes. Entire villages obliterated overnight. On the next page, a photograph that showed the Russian Minister of Magic smiling as he shook hands with the Muggle president. A drunkard, Antonin thought contemptuously, a puppet presiding over collapse. So this was the new order. Secrecy maintained not out of wisdom, but weakness. Wizards hiding behind treaties and handshakes while Muggles tore themselves apart anyway. Grindelwald would have burned this world down and rebuilt it. Voldemort had lacked the courage. Antonin folded the paper carefully, his expression hardening into something cold and resolved. He felt it then, the old fire, dormant but not extinguished. Russia was broken. That made it vulnerable. I didn't leave my home to conquer a school, he murmured, and I didn't return to bow to cowards. Somewhere in the vast, unstable sprawl of the former Soviet Empire, power waited to be claimed. Old magic, forgotten bloodlines, wizards who remembered what it meant to rule rather than hide. The Caspian Sea lay flat and gray, stretching endlessly beneath a low sky. Salt hung in the wind, sharp and familiar, carrying with it memories Antonin had buried for decades. The mansion still stood. Protective wards stirred as he approached, old magic recognizing older blood. The iron gates groaned open without protest. Antonin raised his hand and knocked. Footsteps followed. The door opened to reveal a boy of perhaps 15. His magic flickered instinctively, defensive but untrained. He stared at Antonin's face, then froze. "Uncle," the boy said uncertainly. Antonin stiffened. "Yes," he replied after a pause. "I believe so." The boy swallowed, then stepped aside without another word. From deeper within the house came the sound of hurried footsteps. A woman appeared in the doorway, her hair streaked with gray far too early, her face a mirror of Antonin's own. "Antonin," Yulia whispered. She looked at him as if he were a ghost. He inclined his head slightly. "Hello, Yulia." Her wand was in her hand before she realized it, raised halfway between fear and disbelief. "We thought you were dead," she said. "Or worse. We heard, Britain, dark wizards." "I lived," Antonin said, "and I was wrong." That, more than anything, broke her composure. She laughed once, sharp and breathless, then pressed a hand to her mouth. "You vanished," she said. "You left. Decades, Antonin." Mother died thinking you'd abandoned us for monsters. I did abandon you for a lie. Tom Riddle was no Grindelwald. He was a coward obsessed with a teenage boy and his school. He had no plan to expand abroad and conquer the Muggles. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant crash of waves. At last, Yulia lowered her wand. "Come inside," she said quietly. The house smelled of old wood and sea air. Familiar charms flickered in the corners, family protections passed down, maintained faithfully despite the years. Antonin felt them settle around him, no longer rejecting his presence. The boy lingered nearby, watching him with open curiosity. "My son," Yulia said, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Mikhail." Antonin nodded to him. "You carry our magic strongly." Mikhail straightened at that, pride flickering across his face. Yulia studied her brother, searching for the man she remembered beneath the scars and severity. "Why now?" she asked. "Why come back now?" Antonin looked toward the window, where the Caspian stretched dark and endless. "Because I finally understand what I lost," he said, "and what Russia has become." He turned back to her, eyes hard but resolute. "I left to change the world," he said. "Instead, I fought children and served a man who feared ambition. That will not happen again." Yulia did not answer at once. Then she sighed. "You haven't changed as much as you think," she said. "Only the direction of your fury." She gestured toward the sitting room. "Sit. Eat. If you are to stay, even for a night, you will do so as family." Antonin stepped forward, crossing the threshold fully at last. For the first time in 40 years, he was home. The Wisengamot courtroom beneath Whitehall had been scrubbed of mercy. Banners of the dark mark hung on every wall. The enchanted ceiling glowed a sickly, institutional gray, giving no hint of sky or time. Chains lay coiled at Penelope Clearwater's feet, humming softly as they drank in her magic. She stood alone at the center of the room. Above her, on the highest dais, sat Corban Yaxley, newly crowned minister for magic, his posture stiff with self-importance. He said nothing because he did not need to. The trial was not for justice. It was for demonstration. Dolores Umbridge, chief warlock of the Wisengamot, rose slowly from her seat. Penelope recognized her pink cardigan immediately, untouched by war or consequence. The bow in Umbridge's hair was immaculate. Her smile, small, tight, and pleased, never wavered. "Penelope Clearwater," Umbridge said sweetly, her voice carrying through the chamber. "Former Ravenclaw. Mudblood." A murmur rippled through the assembled witches and wizards, carefully curated and carefully obedient. "You stand accused," Umbridge continued, "of attempting to steal magic not rightfully yours, of interfering with lawful servitude decrees, and of aiding known resistance elements." Penelope tried to remain defiant, refusing to bow down to tyranny. Her wrists burned where the manacles bit into her skin. "I was trying to save Percy Weasley," she said clearly. "What you are forcing him to do to others isn't human." Umbridge's smile widened. "How noble. How predictable." She turned to the Wisengamot. "You see, they always frame their crimes as compassion, as if emotion excuses impurity." Penelope's gaze flicked across the chamber, faces she half recognized, all of them looking anywhere but at her. Wizards who had once debated policy and precedent now sat silent, cowed, and complicit in crimes against humanity. "Do you deny," Umbridge went on, "that you attempted to use magic beyond your station? That you sought to undermine the order His Excellence has so graciously restored?" Penelope gave a joyless laugh. "Order built on chains isn't order. It's fear." That earned her a flick of Umbridge's wand. Pain lanced through Penelope's chest, dropping her to one knee. She gasped but did not scream. Umbridge sighed theatrically. Such theatrics. Honestly, Yaxley, they never learn. She raised her voice. "For crimes against magical purity, for treason against the British wizarding state, and for persistent refusal to accept her place, this court sentences Penelope Clearwater to life imprisonment." Two Dementors glided forward from the shadows. The temperature plummeted. Penelope's breath fogged in front of her as despair pressed in, thick and suffocating. Memories unraveled. She remembered Percy betraying his family over his career at the ministry. She remembered her own family killed by Death Eaters and Leeds. She remembered covering in fear as Percy begged her to come with him to fight in the Battle of Hogwarts. As the Dementors seized her arms, she forced herself to speak one last time. "You can lock us away," she said hoarsely, "but you won't erase us." Umbridge smiled, eyes glittering. "Oh, my dear, that's exactly what we intend to do." The Dementors dragged Penelope from the chamber, their rattling breath echoing down sterile corridors as they descended deeper, past sealed doors and forbidden wards, into the bowels of the ministry. The Department of Mysteries awaited. Cells were already filled with others like her. Families of squibs, muggleborns, and half-bloods sat chained behind bars waiting to be experimented on. Their names had been scrubbed from records, and their lives reduced to inventory. Above ground, Whitehall stood pristine and orderly. Below it, the truth was chained and screaming into the dark. Hogsmeade was unrecognizable. What had once been a cozy village now looked like a besieged fortress. There were now checkpoints, ward pylons, and banners bearing the serpent sigil. The three broomsticks stood shuttered and seized, its windows blacked out, its cellar repurposed into something far colder than a prison. Below the newly established Hogsmeade City Council, a name spoken with mockery by those who remembered what the village had been, cells had been carved into the rock. Cho sat on a narrow cot. Her wand was gone. Her magic felt distant and unreachable. The word blood traitor had been carved into her forearm with a spell that cut without mercy but healed just enough to leave the scar sharp and unmistakable. To her right, Padma and Parvati leaned on each other's shoulders. The door screeched open. Walden McNair filled the doorway. He looked pleased with himself, as if this were a minor errand rather than a cruelty he savored. "It is time," he said, staring at Parvati. "You, on your feet." Padma was moving before Cho could stop her. "No," Padma said, stepping in front of her sister. "Take me. She's. McNair flicked his wand. Ropes snapped into existence, coiling around Padma's arms and yanking her backward into the wall. Cho lunged instinctively, grabbing Parvati's wrist, but McNair was faster. Ropes wrapped around Cho's torso, pinning her arms to her sides. She gasped as the magic bit down, cutting her off from her wandless defenses. Parvati screamed. "Padma," she cried, as McNair seized her by the arm. "Padma, don't let them." Padma thrashed uselessly, sobbing, her voice tearing itself raw as she screamed her sister's name again and again. Cho fought the ropes until they burned against her skin, but McNair only laughed, delighted. "Careful," he said lazily. "You'll bruise yourselves." He dragged Parvati out into the corridor. Her cries echoed once, twice, and then they were gone as the door slammed shut. Padma collapsed to the floor, ropes vanishing as abruptly as they had appeared. She curled in on herself, shaking violently, while breath hitched in broken sobs. Cho knelt beside her friend at once and pulled her close. "They'll kill her," Padma whispered. "I should've. Cho, I should've." Cho shook her head fiercely. "No. Listen to me." Padma looked up. Her eyes were now red from tears. "We're not done," Cho said, trying to remain defiant. "This isn't the end. They think we're broken. That's their mistake." Padma's voice cracked. "How can you know that?" Cho thought of Cedric's quiet courage, of Harry's stubborn refusal to give up, of Michael's laugh. "Because we're still alive," she said. "And as long as we are, there's a way out." She gripped Padma's hands. "We will escape," Cho promised. "And we will find Parvati. I swear it." Padma closed her eyes, clinging to the words as if they were a lifeline. The sea off the coast of Normandy was gray and restless. Hermione watched it from the small rented cottage window. Letters from magical governments all over Europe spread across the table behind her. She already knew the response. She always did. The French Ministry of Magic regrets to inform you. Internal British Affairs. No direct threat beyond current borders. Diplomatic neutrality. She had written to them all. Paris first, carefully, formally, citing international magical law and humanitarian precedent. Then Berlin, Brussels, Amsterdam, and Stockholm. every letter more desperate than the last. Every owl returned carrying rejection wrapped in polite language. Because Voldemort had been contained. Because Britain was burning quietly. Hermione pressed a hand to her stomach without thinking. She had been pregnant for 4 months now. The curve was unmistakable, and her body insisted on the future even as the present felt irreparably broken. Ron sat at the kitchen table, staring at a map of Britain so worn it had begun to tear at the creases. His fingers hovered over familiar names. The Borough, Shell Cottage, Hogsmeade, as if touching them might somehow pull everyone back. "They're just letting it happen," he said, voice tight. "All of them." Ginny paced the room like a caged thing. "Of course they are. As long as Voldemort doesn't cross the channel, they can pretend it's not their problem." Luna sat cross-legged on the floor, gazing out the open door where the wind stirred the grass. "Sometimes," she said softly, "people need the darkness to stay far away before they're willing to see it." Ron snorted bitterly. "Easy to say when it's not your family chained up back home." Ginny stopped pacing. Her hands clenched into fists. "We should go back." Hermione turned sharply. "No." Ginny met her eyes. "We can't just wait." "We can't fight Voldemort with 4 people," Hermione shot back. "And we definitely can't do it while—" She stopped, breath hitching. Ron stood abruptly. "Say it." Hermione swallowed. "While I'm pregnant." The word hung between them, heavy and unforgiving. Ron's anger faltered, replaced by something raw and terrified. He crossed the room and knelt in front of her, resting his forehead against her knee. "I don't care about the war," he said hoarsely. "I care about you. About them." His hand slid to her stomach. "But I can't stand knowing George might still be alive and imprisoned. Or Percy. Or Bill. And we're just here." Ginny's eyes filled with tears. "Harry would have gone back," she whispered. Hermione closed her eyes. "Yes," she said. "He would have." They had escaped to survive, but survival felt hollow when weighed against everything they'd left behind. Friends had been imprisoned. Families were silenced. Britain had been reshaped by fear while the rest of the world watched from a safe distance. Hermione rested both hands over her stomach now, feeling the faint flutter of life beneath her skin. A child growing in a world already broken. "We can't do this alone," she said quietly. "And we can't pretend we're ready." Ron nodded slowly, tears slipping free at last. "So what do we do?" Hermione looked back out at the sea, at the endless gray horizon. "We endure," she said. "We prepare. We gather allies wherever we can, quietly, patiently. And when we go back—" Her voice hardened. "We go back to end it." Rain tapped softly against the tall windows of Buckingham Palace, blurring London into a wash of gray. Prime Minister Tony Blair sat stiffly in the Queen's private sitting room, a leather folder open on his lap, its contents troubling in ways briefings rarely were. "Children," he said again quietly, "vanishing without a trace. No ransom. No bodies, at least, none that make sense." Her Majesty Elizabeth II listened without interruption. Age had not dulled her gaze. If anything, it had sharpened it into something quietly formidable. "And the ones who are found," Blair continued, "they're untouched. No wounds. No toxins. Doctors say it's as if something simply switched them off." The Queen nodded once. "That is not the work of terrorists, Prime Minister." Blair hesitated. "MI5 disagrees. They believe—" "They are wrong," she said gently, but with finality. "Islamists do not kill without leaving a message. These deaths are older than that." She rose and walked toward the window, looking out over the palace grounds. "I have been briefed by ministers for magic since the beginning of my reign," she said. "Some competent, some evasive, all of them fearful." Blair looked up sharply. "Ministers for magic?" "Yes," the Queen said, turning back to him. "You were visited once, were you not?" Blair swallowed. 2 years ago, shortly after I took office." He remembered it vividly now, the fire flaring green in the hearth at number 10, the shock of a man stepping out of it, as if such things were perfectly ordinary. He said his name was Rufus Scrimgeour and began to speak of a hidden war waged by dark wizards. "Voldemort," Blair said slowly. "Death Eaters. Something about pure blood supremacy." The Queen's mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. Then you were warned. Poorly, perhaps, but warned nonetheless. I thought it was a prank, Blair admitted, or a psychological operation. And then nothing. No follow-up. No explanation. Because the wizarding government collapsed, the Queen said, and Britain fell with it, quietly. Blair leaned back, the weight of it settling heavily on his shoulders. He had prepared for Yugoslavia, for Iraq, for Afghanistan, for conflicts that obeyed rules, borders, treaties. He had not prepared for an enemy that did not need tanks or missiles, that left no fingerprints. You're telling me, he said slowly, that a tyrant rules part of this country, and I can't even acknowledge he exists. I am telling you, the Queen replied, that he already does, and that pretending otherwise will only cost more lives. Blair rubbed his face with both hands. What am I supposed to do? Declare war on something I can't name? Mobilize NATO against shadows? The Queen returned to her seat, her expression softer now, but no less resolute. You protect your people, she said, as best you can. Increase security. Watch for patterns. Do not dismiss what cannot be explained. She met his eyes. And when the hidden world finally demands to be seen again, you must be ready. Silence filled the room. Outside, London carried on, unaware that another kind of war was being fought in its streets and beneath its soil. Blair closed the folder slowly. I never imagined, he said, that the most dangerous tyrant of my lifetime would already be ruling within our borders. Few ever do, the Queen replied quietly. Ron held Hermione's left hand tightly as she was about to give birth to their child. He hadn't moved in what felt like hours. His heart pounded so hard he was certain everyone could hear it. Ginny stood crying on the other side of the bed, while Luna watched from the corner, serene and luminous, as if she were witnessing something sacred. Hermione cried out one last time, and then a sound was heard. The healer smiled. She's here. Ron's breath left him in a rush, so sudden his knees nearly buckled. He stared as the healer lifted a tiny, squirming bundle into the air. A girl, the healer said gently. Hermione sobbed, not from pain this time, but from relief so deep it seemed to empty her. Her head fell back against the pillows as the baby was placed against her. Ron couldn't speak. He had fought monsters. He had watched friends die. He had fled a country under tyranny. None of that compared to this. That's our, his voice broke. He swallowed hard, eyes fixed on the impossibly small hand curling around Hermione's finger. I'm Merlin, Hermione. I'm a dad. Hermione laughed weakly through tears. You are, she said. At 19. Ginny wiped her face with her sleeve and stepped closer, smiling. She's beautiful, she whispered. What are you going to call her? Ron stared at the baby, at the faint shock of red-gold hair already visible against her scalp. The world and the war on the other side of the English Channel fell away for just a moment. Rose, he said suddenly. Rose Weasley. Hermione looked up at him. She considered it for half a second. Rose, she repeated, smiling. Rose Granger Weasley. Yes, that's her. The healer adjusted the blankets and quietly slipped away, leaving them alone in the hush that followed miracles. Luna stepped forward and peered down at the newborn with solemn interest. She's very brave, she said. You can tell. Ginny laughed softly. She'll have to be. Ron reached out, trembling now, and touched Rose's tiny hand. She curled her fingers around his without hesitation, anchoring him to the present in a way nothing else ever had. Outside, the war still raged in shadows. Britain was still lost. Friends were still imprisoned. Vengeance still waited its in that quiet hospital room in Paris. Something new had entered the world. It was hope born of love and stubborn, ordinary courage. Spinner's End endured. Number 12 remained hunched and forgotten, a place the world had learned to overlook. Severus lived there alone. To the wizarding world, he was dead. To the Muggle neighbors, he was merely another silent, reclusive man who kept odd hours and never invited company. Both misunderstandings suited him perfectly. Inside, the house had been stripped of its past and rebuilt in function, if not in memory. The kitchen, once the stage for Tobias Snape's drunken rages, now held cauldrons instead of bottles, and ingredients arranged with ruthless order. Potions simmered constantly, their vapors carefully vented through warded chimneys. Every motion Severus made was precise and deliberate. Control was the only comfort he trusted. He spent his days brewing and reading, refusing to make contact with the outside world. The Daily Prophet arrived each morning, its headlines shriller by the week. Severus skimmed it with thinly veiled contempt. He read about pure-blood decrees and security edicts. Hogsmeade had been reclassified as a city under direct ministry control. Magical travel had been outlawed. Broomsticks, apparition, portkeys, and the flu network were now restricted to the pure-blood elite. Voldemort's Britain was being sealed shut, one law at a time. Severus set the paper aside and reached for a Muggle newspaper, The Guardian, instead. He had learned long ago that ignorance was a choice. There were reports of disappearances across England. Children had vanished without witnesses, without physical injury, and without explanation. Doctors were baffled. The police were searching for a threat they didn't even know existed. Severus continued reading news from abroad. NATO strikes in Yugoslavia. Cities reduced to coordinates. Chechnya burned quietly in the Caucasus. The United States positioned itself for war with Iraq, speaking of weapons of mass destruction and inevitability in the same breath. Severus leaned back in his chair, fingers pressed together, eyes fixed on nothing. Voldemort believed himself to be a god. Yet he was only a tyrant who had conquered an island and called it destiny. How small that seemed now. Muggles waged wars without wands and without spells. Their wars were global, constant, and endlessly adaptive. They annihilated from a distance, perfected destruction, turned death into industry. The scale alone dwarfed anything the Death Eaters had ever accomplished. Tom Riddle feared chaos. That was his great flaw. He sought control, hierarchy, obedience, and an ordered world frozen beneath his will. Dumbledore had opposed him with ideals and sacrifice. Harry Potter had opposed him with courage and love. Both had failed. Severus's thoughts darkened, sharpening into something colder than grief. Lily's face rose unbidden in his mind, not as she had died, but as she had lived, defiant, compassionate, and impossibly brave. Tom Riddle had taken her. For that, the price could not be simple death. No more heroes, Severus whispered into the silence of the house. If Voldemort wished to rule forever, then Severus would give him something far worse than rebellion. He would give him a war without rules, a conflict without prophecy or mercy, an enemy drawn not from ancient magic or noble lineage, but from the brutal, inventive savagery of the world Voldemort had always dismissed as inferior. The air in the Prime Minister's office thickened. Tony Blair was skimming a briefing paper when the lights dimmed, as if something had sucked the warmth from the room. Smoke, not from the fireplace, but from nowhere at all, coiled suddenly in the center of the carpet, dark and unnatural, spiraling upward. Blair staggered back as the smoke condensed. A man stood where empty air had been seconds before. He was tall, gaunt, and dressed entirely in black. What the Blair began. The man raised both hands slowly, deliberately non-threatening. Please, he said calmly, do not call security. Blair's heart thundered. His instincts screamed intruder, terrorist, hallucination. His hand shot toward the desk phone anyway. Before he could touch it, the man bent and let a slender wooden object fall from his fingers. It struck the carpet with a soft tap. My wand, the man said. I am unarmed. Blair stared at the object, then back at the man. You materialized out of smoke in my office, he snapped. You don't get to call yourself unarmed. Fair, the man replied evenly. Blair backed toward the wall, breathing hard. Who are you? Severus Snape. The name meant nothing, yet something in the way it was spoken told Blair it should. I was a member of an organization known as the Order of the Phoenix, Snape continued. We opposed Tom Riddle, Lord Voldemort. Blair felt his stomach drop. Voldemort, he repeated. You're real. Unfortunately. You're a bit late to the conversation, Blair said sharply. People are disappearing. I am aware, Snape said, and there was no defensiveness in his voice, only weight. That is why I am here. Blair studied him closely now. This was not zealotry, not triumph. It was exhaustion sharpened into purpose. You expect me to trust you, Blair said. A man who walked out of thin air. I do not expect trust, Snape replied. Only cooperation. And why should I give you that? Because I infiltrated Voldemort's inner circle for nearly 20 years, Snape said. I survived as a double agent under Albus Dumbledore's command. And because, at present, I am the only person alive who understands how these attacks are being carried out and how to stop them. Blair shook his head. You could be lying. If I were, Snape said quietly, you would already be under my control, or dead, or unaware that this conversation ever happened. You're asking me, Blair said slowly, to wage a war I can't acknowledge. Snape met his gaze. You are already losing it. Silence stretched between them. Blair glanced once more at the wand on the floor and at the man who had disarmed himself before speaking a single demand. Finally, he exhaled. All right, he said. You help us. On my terms. No more surprises. Snape inclined his head slightly. Understood. Blair straightened his jacket, unease settling into grim resolve. If this goes wrong. It might, Snape said softly. Blair swallowed. Then God help us. Snape's expression did not change. God, he said, is not involved. In the heart of Britain's Muggle power, an alliance was forged, born not of trust, but of necessity, and sealed by the knowledge that the hidden war had finally found its way into the open. The cells beneath Hogsmeade did not measure time kindly. Days blurred into one another, marked only by the scrape of boots, the clang of doors, the ration meals shoved through iron slots. Cho and Padma learned to exist inside that blur. They were not allowed wands. Wands meant agency. Wands meant defiance. Without them, the Death Eaters believed, the prisoners were reduced to bodies that breathed and obeyed. The Death Eaters were wrong. Cho learned not to scream. Padma learned not to beg. Both learned that survival was a quiet, stubborn thing. At night, when the corridors finally fell silent, they sat pressed together on the cold stone floor and closed their eyes. Remember Guangzhou? Cho whispered once. My aunt used to light incense without touching it. Padma's breath hitched, but she nodded. My grandmother healed burns with nothing but her hands. Said the wand was a convenience, not a necessity. In China and India, magic flowed differently. In Asia, magicians were less dependent on tools. Wandless magic was not a lost art there. It was tradition, discipline, and inheritance. Here, it was forbidden, forgotten, and dismissed. Cho pictured her aunt's calm hands, the way magic gathered like mist before. It's harder without space, Padma murmured once, forehead pressed to the wall. Without freedom. Cho nodded. And without hope. Still, they tried again. They practiced with crumbs of bread, drops of water, urging warmth into cold fingers and their own bruises. They experienced failure after failure. And then, once, just once, did you? Padma whispered. Cho nodded, afraid to speak. It was not much. It was not enough. It would not break chains or open doors, but it was something. Voldemort sat at the head of the long table. His red eyes drifted over what remained of his inner circle. They were fewer now and hardened by victory that had begun to taste like ash. 1 year ago, Voldemort began softly. The last meaningful resistance to my rule was extinguished. Hogwarts fell. Britain was brought to heel. Bellatrix's breath hitched in reverence. The world remembers power, Voldemort continued, and it forgets. The windows rattled. A low, unfamiliar thrum rolled through the air, growing louder by the second. Voldemort recognized the sound immediately. The sound did not belong to magic. The chandeliers trembled. Dust drifted from the ceiling. Greyback snarled, confused. Yaxley frowned. The iron gates at the far end of the grounds burst inward. Helicopters roared overhead. Armored vehicles tore across the lawn, flattening hedges. Floodlights snapped on, bathing Malfoy Manor in harsh white light. What is this? Narcissa exclaimed in fear. The front doors detonated inward. Masked men in dark uniforms, armed with guns and rifles, surged through the smoke. Voldemort stood and staggered backwards. Despite his immortality, he knew with clarity the danger they were in. The tide of the war had changed, and it was not in his favor. How? Yaxley exclaimed. Bellatrix laughed. Oh, how delightful. She spun, and her wand flashed. Avada Kedavra. Green light tore through the hall. One soldier dropped instantly, lifeless, before he hit the marble floor. Then the world erupted. Gunfire cracked like thunder. Bullets tore into walls, shattered portraits, and ripped through dark robes. Spells collided with steel and fire. Red, green, and blue light streaked the air. One bullet struck Selwyn in the chest, causing him to fall on the floor and drop his wand. Another bullet hit Travers in the leg, incapacitating the wizard in pure agony. One soldier pulled the trigger on his assault rifle, and Rabastin Lestrange's head blew into pieces. "Brother!" Rodolphus screamed. Then he raised his wand. Confringo. Blue fire burned 5 soldiers alive, but one managed to take cover. Lucius raised his wand. However, the Muggle soldier was faster. A gunshot was fired, and Lucius collapsed on the marble floor as a bullet tore through his chest. "Father!" Draco screamed. Narcissa did not hesitate. She seized Draco and vanished with a crack of apparition. "Retreat!" Yaxley shouted, already disappearing. The Caros vanished next. Greyback snarled in fury, then fled. Umbridge shrieked as she apparat. Chaos swallowed the hall. Andromeda did not flee. She turned and ran for the dungeons to protect the children. Bellatrix stood her ground. Burn! Fiend fire shaped like living beasts surged forward, devouring soldiers, metal, and stone alike. Screams filled the air as flames took form. Voldemort rose in the air. The Muggle soldiers fired their guns at him, but Voldemort's magic forced the bullets to stop midair. The bullets curved and bent, as if reality itself refused to obey them. Then they were fired back at the soldiers who fell screaming in agony. His wand slashed downward, and a shockwave of magic tore through the entrance hall. Dozens of soldiers were flung backward as if struck by an invisible giant. Entire squadrons collapsed at once and fell stunned on the marble floor. Above the manor, helicopters circled relentlessly. Outside, more vehicles arrived. Voldemort smiled, not in triumph, but in interest. "So," he hissed, "the Muggles have finally chosen to notice." He raised the Elder Wand again, and the war, hidden for decades, spilled fully into the open. Malfoy Manor was in ruins, surrounded by helicopter wreckage and empty armored vehicles from the British Army's failed invasion. Bodies of Muggle soldiers and Death Eaters lay everywhere, both inside and outside the ruins of the mansion. Magic and machinery had torn each other apart here, and neither had won. Draco knelt beside his father. Lucius lay on his back, eyes open, staring at nothing as blood poured out of his chest from bullet wounds. There was no elegance in death now. Draco's hands shook as he touched his father's sleeve. "No," he whispered, over and over, as if the word alone could undo it. "No, please." Narcissa collapsed beside them. She clutched Lucius's chest, sobbing openly. Bellatrix stood a short distance away, Delphine cradled tightly against her chest. The child slept, blissfully unaware of the carnage that had unfolded around them. "They will pay," Bellatrix murmured, as she stroked her daughter's dark hair. "Every last one of them. I swear it to you, my love." Nearby, Andromeda stood frozen, holding Teddy close. The boy whimpered softly, sensing fear even if he could not understand it. Andromeda turned her face away from the carnage, from her sisters, and from the world that had destroyed everything she loved. A tearing sound echoed across the ruins. Nagini fed. The great serpent coiled around Selwyn's corpse, swallowing flesh with obscene ease. No one bothered to stop her. Then the air changed. Voldemort appeared without a sound at the center of the courtyard. He saw dead followers and dead enemies. He saw grief, rage, fear, and weakness. His numbers were thinning. His secrecy was shattered. The Muggles had dared to strike at him openly and lived long enough to tell the tale. He knew that he would not survive another challenge by half measures. Voldemort raised his voice. "No more restraint," he said, cold and absolute. "No more shadows." Bellatrix fell to her knees instantly, clutching Delphine closer. Draco staggered to his feet. "They killed my father," he said, looking up at Voldemort. "I will serve you. Fully. I swear it. For him." Voldemort regarded the boy for a long moment, then inclined his head. "Then you will learn," he said, what vengeance truly means. He turned his gaze outward, beyond the ruined manor, beyond Britain itself. All muggles, Voldemort declared, his voice carrying like a curse across the land, will feel my wrath. Above them, the sky darkened. The war, no longer hidden, had only just begun. Voldemort, Bellatrix, and Draco appeared without warning on the steps of Broadcasting House. Metropolitan police officers shouted, rifles coming up on instinct. Bellatrix laughed. She spread her arms, and fire bloomed. A perfect ring of magical flames surged outward, swallowing the guards whole as they screamed in agony. Draco blew up the entrance doors with a single spell, and the three figures walked inside the Broadcasting House. Cameras toppled, papers scattered. Someone was crying openly as alarms screamed through the corridors. Draco followed a step behind. Bellatrix drifted after them like a living curse. They reached the studio just as a live broadcast was underway. A presenter froze mid-sentence. Voldemort raised his wand, and all cameras turned toward him. Across Britain, across Europe, across the world, screens flickered and steadied. And then he was there. Now millions saw the Dark Lord, his serpentine features, pale face, and red eyes. A presence that seemed to warp the air around him. The silence that followed was total, absolute, as if the planet itself had leaned closer. I am Lord Voldemort, he said calmly. For centuries, your governments have lied to you, hidden the truth, controlled the narrative of your small, fragile world. He stepped closer to the camera. Bellatrix stood just out of frame, smiling. Draco remained visible in the background, out of place. Magic is real, Voldemort continued, and magic is might. Somewhere, a glass shattered. This broadcast exists because your soldiers dared to attack my people. They failed, as all muggles will fail when they forget their place. His voice hardened. I hereby declare war on the Crown and Parliament of Britain, on the illusion of equality, on the lie that power belongs to the many. The lights flickered as magic surged through the building. A new world order will rise, Voldemort said, one where wizards rule openly, where we no longer hide in shadows while you wage your petty wars. He leaned in, eyes filling the screen. The statute of secrecy is broken, permanently. Outside, sirens wailed. The war between wizards and muggles, Voldemort finished softly, has begun. Smoke coiled through the shattered studio. Then it moved. It thickened, twisted, rose, and from it emerged a man flying without a broom. Gasps rippled through the studio, through the streets outside, and through the millions watching across the world. Voldemort stiffened in fear and confusion. Severus, he hissed, red eyes widening. I killed you. You tried to kill me, Tom, Severus said, using the name like a blade. As you tried with Lily. Now you will pay. Draco's breath caught. His wand snapped up instinctively, though his hands shook out of fear and confusion. Bellatrix's eyes blazed with manic disbelief. A traitor, she spat. You should have stayed dead. Voldemort raised a hand. Stand down, he commanded softly. They froze in obedience. He is mine. Severus did not flinch. This won't end tonight, Tom, he said, using the name like a blade. You may kill me, but the muggles will make you bleed for all eternity. Deep inside, Voldemort knew that his former apprentice was right, and it caused him to snap in anger. Avada Kedavra. Green light tore through the air, but Severus moved quickly, and the curse missed by inches, shattering a camera instead. In the same breath, both wizards rose higher, blasting through the ceiling in an explosion of glass, smoke, and magic. They burst into the open sky, and London screamed. Above Portland Place, two figures dueled like gods at war. Killing curses carved green scars through clouds. Fiendfire roared in controlled spirals, met by counter curses sharp as razors. Shockwaves rattled buildings. Windows shattered. Muggles stared upward in terror and awe. Police forgot to fire. Soldiers lowered their guns. Cameras tracked the impossible while reporters screamed into microphones. Voldemort struck again and again, relentless and merciless. Severus answered every spell. He did for Lily, for himself and the life that had been taken from him. At last, Voldemort drew back. His eyes burned with ancient fury. "This ends now," he snarled. The final curse erupted from the Elder Wand, brighter, faster, and absolute. Severus saw it coming. He did not dodge. There was no fear on his face as the green light struck his chest. His body went still, and then he fell through the London sky into the dark waters of the Thames below. The river swallowed him whole. High above, Voldemort hovered alone. Far beyond the noise, beyond the war, beyond the pain, Severus woke up, and green eyes looked back at him. The television glowed in the dim room, its images flickering as if the screen itself were struggling to process what it was showing. London was burning. Helicopter footage shook, smoke curled between landmarks Ron had seen 100 times in books and photographs. Streets were packed with screaming people and terrified soldiers who had no clue what they were shooting at. The BBC logo sat in the corner of the screen like a cruel joke. Ginny stood frozen with one hand pressed to her mouth. They're showing him," she said. "They're actually showing him." On screen, Voldemort's pale face filled the world. Hermione felt sick. She had grown up believing that secrecy was protection, that the hidden world stayed hidden because exposure would destroy everyone. She had never imagined that she would see the Dark Lord addressing the entire planet like a conquering tyrant. "This isn't just Britain anymore," Luna said softly, as though she were already mourning a future that hadn't yet arrived. "It's everywhere." Rose stirred in Hermione's arms, fussing quietly. Hermione held her closer, heart pounding, every instinct screaming to shield her daughter from a world that had just shattered. Then the camera cut. Now it showed smoke inside a ruined studio. A man was rising through the air. "No," Ron breathed. "No way." Hermione's breath caught. "That's Snape," Ginny finished, disbelief and horror twisting together. They watched as Severus Snape, dead a year ago, mourned and buried in memory, stood alive and defiant before Voldemort. They watched the killing curse miss, the ceiling shatter, and the duel continue into the open sky. Ron's hands clenched into fists. "He's fighting him," Ron said hoarsely. "Merlin, he's actually fighting him." Hermione couldn't speak. The final curse struck. They all screamed at once as Snape fell, vanishing into the dark waters of the Thames. The broadcast cut to black. Hermione sank onto the sofa, tears streaming unchecked, Rose beginning to cry in confusion. She pressed her face into her daughter's hair. "I never thought it could get worse," she said. "I never thought it could be this." Ron wrapped an arm around her and rose. Ginny turned away. Luna stared at the blank screen, pale and unblinking. The war had stepped out of the shadows. No one, wizard or muggle, could pretend it wasn't their problem anymore. Darkness rolled over London like a living tide. Thousands of Dementors poured through the city, hovering between buildings, gliding down streets choked with smoke and fear. Sirens wailed until they cut off abruptly, one by one, replaced by screaming. Police officers fired desperately as the creatures descended. Bullets passed straight through them. Hope was drained from the air itself. Men and women collapsed where they stood. Their eyes became hollow as their souls were torn away from their bodies, as the Dementors administered the kiss without mercy. Soldiers dropped their weapons, sobbing, as memories ripped out of them in silent agony. Civilians ran in blind panic, trampling one another, fleeing an enemy that could not be seen, could not be touched, and could not be reasoned with. A crack like thunder split the air outside Buckingham Palace. Voldemort appeared at the forecourt gates, flanked by Bellatrix, Rodolphus, Draco, and Greyback. The British armed forces had formed a defensive perimeter around the palace. They opened fire, but the bullets curved midair, turned, and returned. Men fell in rows, screams echoing across the mall as their own weapons tore them apart. Bellatrix laughed. She raised her wand and unleashed fiendfire. Living flames surged outward in a ring, coiling into monstrous shapes that devoured barricades, vehicles, and soldiers alike. The fire roared hungrily, scattering the remaining defenders in chaos as the palace grounds became an inferno. The great gates of Buckingham Palace burst inward. Voldemort strode through the smoke without slowing. Inside, palace guards raised bayonets with shaking hands, clinging to tradition and duty against something utterly beyond them. Voldemort did not bother casting a killing curse. A single sweeping motion of his wand sent them flying, broken, unconscious, lifeless, crashing into marble and gilded walls. "Where?" Voldemort asked calmly as he stepped into the grand hall. "Is your royal family?" Alone, terrified guard crawled backward on the floor. "Gone," he stammered. "Evacuated. Abroad. France." Bellatrix didn't wait. Avada Kedavra. Green light struck the guard square in the chest as he fell without a sound. Voldemort surveyed the palace, the paintings, the chandeliers, and the centuries of authority built on illusion and blood. Then he turned back to his followers. "This seat of power is mine," he declared. His voice carried beyond the walls, beyond the gates, echoing through a city on its knees. "By conquest, by right, by magic." He raised his wand. "I am the Serpent King of England." Outside, Dementors swarmed the skies. Inside, the Dark Lord claimed his throne. After several days of travel across Scotland, Cho and Padma had finally reached the Chang's family apartment in Glasgow. No one knew they were here. For Cho, it was the only solace she could find in a world turned upside down. She hadn't been back to her family's home in over 2 years, not since the Death Eaters had taken control of the ministry 2 years ago. Her father had been an Auror, a fierce, proud man who'd spent his life protecting the magical world from dark wizards in both China and Britain. He had died in the early months of the war, one of many victims in Voldemort's relentless hunt. Cho didn't know what had happened to her mother. The last time she'd seen her, she'd been working in the Department for International Cooperation, an unassuming job that had seemed so distant from the horrors the wizarding world now faced. Cho's mind had searched endlessly for answers, but all she had were questions. Was her mother dead, like her father? Or had she been taken, imprisoned in Azkaban for the crime of being a Muggle-born witch? It felt like an eternity since that day. Padma sat across from her, staring at the dim light coming through the crack in the curtains. "I can't stop thinking about her," Padma murmured, breaking the silence. "I don't know what to do. What if she's been changed? Like the others? What if they—" "Don't think like that," Cho interrupted softly, even though her heart ached with her friend's pain. "We'll find her, Padma. I promise. We'll find a way." Padma began to cry. "But how? We can't even defend ourselves. We don't have wands. And I can't even feel magic the way I used to. It's like it's been stolen from us. I don't know how much longer I can hold on to hope." Cho realized Padma was right. They had nothing left but each other and the fragile hope that, someday, they would be able to fight back. That they could somehow resist the tide of darkness sweeping over their world. "We have to survive first," Cho said softly, sitting beside her friend. "We need to get better at wandless magic. It's the only way we can defend ourselves for now. We may not have our wands, but we still have the magic inside us." Padma nodded slowly but didn't meet her gaze. Cho didn't push her. For the first time since they had taken refuge in Glasgow, Cho allowed herself to acknowledge how tired she was. She was tired of running and tired of wondering whether her family was alive or dead, and tired of fighting a war she could barely understand. But they had each other, and that, in the end, was all they could rely on. The screaming dragged Cho out of sleep. It wasn't a single cry. It was dozens, hundreds, layered over one another, sharp and animal, echoing through the night like the city itself was being torn open. Padma was already awake. They met each other's eyes in the dark and felt the dread. "That's not," Padma began. Cho was already at the window. The street below was chaos. Shapes moved against the sky. Wings, vast and leathery, unfolded from hunched figures as they dropped from rooftops and street lamps. They slammed into walls, clawed their way upward, and shattered windows with inhuman strength. "Vampires," Cho whispered in horror. Giant bat-like wings burst from their backs, mouths split wide to reveal rows of fangs as they descended on screaming civilians. A man was dragged out of his front door. A woman fell from a balcony. Blood spattered the pavement. "Oh God," Padma whispered. Cho's stomach twisted. London had fallen. Now the rest of Britain was being harvested. We can't stay, Cho said immediately. We have to go now. Padma grabbed the first thing within reach, a kitchen knife. Cho snatched a cheap Muggle lighter from the table. The building shook. Something slammed against their door. Wood splintered. Cho! The door burst inward. A red-eyed and half-naked vampire lunged into the apartment. Cho didn't think. She flicked the lighter, and a tiny flame sparked to life. She poured everything into it. Memory, fear, rage, screams, her father's face, Parvati's name, and the will to survive. The flame exploded. Fire roared outward, unnatural and sudden, racing across the floor and walls. The vampire shrieked as its flesh caught fire. The apartment ignited in seconds, setting curtains and furniture on fire. Run! Cho screamed. They bolted down the stairwell, coughing, stumbling, past other doors bursting open. They burst into the street as the fire spread throughout the building behind. Hundreds of vampires filled the sky now, swarming like locusts. Cars sat abandoned, doors flung open, alarms wailed across the Scottish capital. Cho yanked open the door of a nearby car, keys still dangling from the ignition. They didn't hesitate. Padma slammed the door shut as Cho started the engine, tires screeching as they tore down the street. In the rearview mirror, Cho saw wings blotting out the streetlights, homes burning, and people running and falling and not getting back up. The city disappeared behind them in smoke and fire. Neither of them spoke. They drove south into the dark, knowing only one thing with terrifying certainty. There was nowhere left in Britain that was safe.